Before we go on to talk about different graphs of sine functions, I would first like to talk about the periods of each of the sine functions that we looked at the basic shapes of before. Let me use the same set of slides here. The period for sine is the period between 0 and 2 pi. So the actual period is 2 pi, but we look at it in between 0 and 2 pi. For cosine, it's the same thing. The actual period is 2 pi. We look at it in between 0 and 2 pi. For tangent, the period of tangent is actually pi. In other words, it's the length between the first quarter point and the last quarter point. The first quarter point is negative pi over 2. The last quarter point is pi over 2. If you subtract those two, pi over 2 minus negative pi over 2, you would actually get pi. So the period is pi, but you look at this in between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. Notice here that I'm using open parentheses indicating that pi over 2 and negative pi over 2 are asymptotes. For cotangent, the period is pi, but we look at it over a different interval. We look at it on the interval from 0 to pi. For secant, secant is a little bit different because we have asymptotes in between. Okay, the period of secant is 2 pi. In other words, that's the length. But we look at this and we say, well, in between 0 and 2 pi, we need to make sure we say that we can't have theta equaling pi over 2, nor can we have theta equaling 3 pi over 2 for that interval. For cosecant, the same thing. The actual period for cosecant is 2 pi. That's the length of the interval. But we can't have theta equaling 0 or 0 pi or 2 pi. So even though we look from 0 to 2 pi, we say that we have to leave a couple of things out. We have to leave out 0, we have to leave out pi, and we have to leave out 2 pi. So I guess that being the case, then technically what I should have up here is open intervals indicating that those are asymptotes. The other thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about amplitudes. Amplitudes tells you how high and how low your graphs go. If I scroll back up to sine, okay, the amplitude of sine that means how high do I go and how low do I go. It has an amplitude of 1. I go 1 unit up and I go 1 unit down. See, the same thing can be said about cosine. Cosine, the amplitude is 1. I go 1 unit up and 1 unit down. Okay, tangent. What's the amplitude of tangent? Technically, I have no amplitude because I go up and down infinitely. The same thing for cotangent. Amplitude, you have none. Okay, we don't usually talk about amplitudes for secant and cosecant except for how they relate to the guide function cosine. In other words, do y'all see that here the amplitude of cosine was 1, and so we know that secant can go either above 1 or below -1. The same thing for cosecant. The guide function sine, this sine function goes up to 1 and down to -1, and so cosecant must go above 1 and below -1. This concludes the lesson on periods and amplitude of trig functions.